think there's a fair amount in there that's a general framework of what your response to somebody who's suicidal, and then the rest is other specific training and experience that you have. I think the longer experience you have, the more you can judge when to intervene and how forcefully to intervene. So, but the framework, that's what those things are for, really. And we'll go over those specifically, and then I can make some comment about them in regards. Well, I was right. Doug's here. Come on up. Come on up. I'll hand this off to you.
You're picking on me already, and I just didn't even walk in.
You mind putting that around your neck? It will record your voice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And are you going off of them?
Yeah. All right. I was better than I thought I was. You guys are already making fun of me. Whatever. All right. So we can hand these around. This is a handout that goes along with what Doug's going to be talking about. Walk and chew down at the same time. All right, so I've been mentioning getting you all set up for reputation. Doug is a real good friend of mine. He and I first met when he was executive director at Southwest Counseling Associates, and that's when I kind of jumped back into the counseling world after a short hiatus. And we've stayed in touch ever since around this very same issue that you're going to be hearing from him with dissociation and DID. There's some of this material that you'll set up for Wednesday. We'll talk some more about specifics with psych disorders related to trauma and trauma-related disorders and so forth. So give him a round of applause for his being here and enjoy what he has to say.
And Ray, what time?
About 1:45.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Had to make sure my nephew wasn't in the class, but he's not, so that's good. We're going to talk about dissociative disorders today. And so the outline, we're going to get to maybe half or part of the outline. Part of it we're not going to get to. But dissociative disorders are a field of specialization, really, in psychology. And it's related to trauma, severe trauma, or severe neglect, or trauma and abuse, obviously, or neglect, or both. It's an extreme reaction to an abnormal situation. So in the field of psychology, we'd consider it kind of a normal thing. In other words, they're a person that is responding in a healthy way to a very unhealthy situation. Post-traumatic stress disorder is like that. When you go through traumatic events, you are going to be impacted by the trauma of it. Well, dissociation is no different. So dissociation means to separate or to sever two things apart, and you'll see that on the definition. So to separate from reality is dissociation. Now, all children have an innate ability to dissociate. They can become someone they're not. I had one daughter who all of a sudden was Victoria Parker, and I have no idea where she came up. And we were supposed to call her Victoria. And another daughter at some point says yes means no and no means yes. And they just enter these make-believe worlds, and they have make-believe friends. And this is how children learn. It's the ability to separate from your actual environment and create an alternative parallel universe, if you will, another world that you go into. And children learn it for play and development. And generally, as we get older through puberty and teenage years and on, we lose the ability to dissociate like we did as children. We're not as good at it. We become more and more grounded in reality. But a healthy person knows how to do some dissociating. We're able to dissociate, but it's in a milder form. So if we watch a movie and we really like the movie and it draws us in, and now we feel like we're kind of actually a player in the movie or a drone flying through the scene, and we're not just sitting in our chair in our living room or in a movie theater or something, that's dissociation. We feel like we got drawn into the picture. Or you're reading a good book and pretty soon you're just drawn into the story as if you're living it along with the characters. You go on vacation and you just kind of check out. You know the real world is waiting for you when you get back, but you just kind of disappear and enjoy the break that you have. I was just at an African-style wedding in Texas over the weekend, and my wife and I dissociated into Africa. And it was a whole wonderful Sierra Leone African experience. We knew the world was waiting for us when we came back, but we absolutely enjoyed it. Healthy people know how to dissociate to at least a mild sort of a way. Now, I always feel sorry for engineers and people like that that are so cognitive and all that dissociation seems like a waste of time or something. But learning a healthy balance there is good. Well, so why does it become a problem in the field of psychology? Well, when you have people who are traumatized or abused repetitively, chronically, over a period of time, I want you to imagine you're God in heaven, and you're looking down on earth, and you see all these children being abused and traumatized and neglected. And you've got a couple of options. One option is you could zap the bad guys and just knock them over and protect the child, right? I like that one, but God doesn't seem to like it as much as I do. But one option would be to intervene and protect the child. Now, obviously, he designed parents and adults to be primary protectors for children. That's a responsibility certainly we as parents have, and really adults in society have. And when the adults are doing their job, that's another way to create a field of protection around our kids. But when kids are being abused or neglected, often by their primary caregivers, what are they going to do to protect themselves? It's really hard for a child to karate chop a guy that's trying to rape her or hurt her and then throw him down and then run out and call 911 and get the police to adjudicate. It's hard to do. It's hard for a teenager to do in some ways, but it's really impossible for a child. When a child is being abused and they go tell mom or somebody, a teacher, and nothing happens, or they don't get protected, or it comes back them harder, they can't get away. They are literally powerless victims. Does that make sense? So you're God in heaven and you look down and see this going on this world that's been so flawed by sin. What do you do? How do you help these kids? Well, I can't point to a chapter verse in the Bible, so call me a heretic if you want. But a Doug Feil theory is God created dissociation as a defense mechanism for these children. Because children dissociate well to begin with, they have that innate ability. Now when a child is being abused or severe neglect will do the very same thing, and they have nowhere literally to go. The adults aren't protecting them. God's not nuking the abusers. They have nowhere to go for safety or protection, so they go inside. They have the ability to disappear internally into this dissociative parallel universe world. And depending on the severity of the abuse and the severity of the dissociation, they will get more and more dissociated on this continuum we're going to talk about in a minute. So I believe it's God's way to protect children. They can't remove the body. If they're being abused, they're being raped, they're being incested, they're being hurt, or they're being neglected. They cry out for somebody, please come, I'm hungry. And nobody comes ever and just tell them, shut up, or don't even respond. Their body is stuck in that situation. They can't protect themselves. They can't remove themselves. So God allowed them the ability to go inside, even though their body is left behind. And by going inside, they're able to stay amazingly sane when you see what horrific things people have to go through. So this continuum on the front of your notes is showing from low to high. When When there's low dissociation, it's really a healthy range. We all function better if we can kind of escape reality, take brief breaks, and go away and kind of take a mental and physical break. But the further toward the high direction you go, the more and more abuse or neglect it takes to trigger this defense. And the higher you go, these are different psychological disorders listed in the DSM-5, depending on how far you go, what the disorder is. On the back page, you'll have another continuum. This comes thanks to Dr. Heather Gingrich. She's a professor over at Denver Seminary and teaches in their counseling program. And this is a continuum she designed, and it's something Dr. Mitch could go over with you. But the idea of a continuum is to think of dissociation progressively from low to high. And the higher it goes, the worse it is. And then you'll see the very highest, the most severe pronounced problem is DID, or dissociative identity disorder. And that's where the dissociation is so severe that they literally create different people in the same body. And when you're in a counseling setting, these are the most severely dissociated of the whole population. Now, the good news is it is treatable. This is people with good counseling and help can get better. The bad news is it takes quite a while, and a lot of counselors don't really know how to deal with this or deal with it very well. And so it's really critical for people when they're dissociative to get the right kind of help. And if they're DID, there's really some elements that are really critical. So from a counseling standpoint, in a couple of the notes, you'll see, number one, it only occurs when in really bad situations, severe abuse, bad neglect. This is something Dr. Mitch has too. This is something I've worked with for years and years, and I could tell story after story after story of people abused by mom, by dad, by stepdad, by grandpa, by you name it. There's every kind of abuse imaginable, and I don't want to put sick images in any of your minds. As a counselor, it's really sensory overload, and I don't know if you'll get to secondary PTSD, but people who work with people like this, as they tell their stories, they're so utterly horrific that you, after the session, feel not just slimed, but traumatized yourself. And it wasn't even your life. You were talking to somebody else about their life. The biblical example I like there is Jeremiah chapter 7, where God is rebuking the children of Israel because when they got in the promised land, rather than clearing it out, they let the Baal and the Molech and some of these worshipers continue in their worship, idol worship. And one of the things they were doing is sacrificing their own children to fire. They were burning in human sacrifice their own children. And this was the children of Israel. And so in Jeremiah 7, where God is judging the people through Jeremiah, he makes a phrase in there that's mentioned 2 or 3 times in the book of Jeremiah. And it says that God, when they saw them sacrificing their own children to idols, that it says that these were things that had not even occurred to God's mind, which I find an amazing phrase. I mean, God is sovereign. He's all-knowing. He's not saying, what? I had no idea. No, he knows that. But the phrase is, it hadn't even occurred to his mind. It's like, it's just so crazy. It's so off the charts. It's so unbelievable that I grew up in California in the hippie 60s. It would be, the way we'd say it is, blow your mind. Just blow your mind when you hear it. And those are the kinds of stories working with this, especially the further up the continuum you got. From a counselor standpoint, remember dissociation is a gift from God. It protected them. So as a counselor, if you come in like some great thing and you're going to get them, knock it off, quit dissociating, you got to ground in reality, you're going to absolutely, utterly destroy them. So you have to respect the defense. You've got to go gently and progressively. And by the way, they don't trust you at all. And why should they? People who should have been totally trustworthy in their lives did the worst harm to them, so nobody's trustworthy. And it takes years and years and years. Yeah.
So essentially, basically what you're saying is that it's ignorance is bliss in the sense that they create a reality which suits their needs and their limitations psychologically, which will comfort them. And so my question is, in today's society, it seems increasingly so that people are actually like seeking this out, seeking out this association, whether it be through virtual reality or the rise of technology. I think we all have played a part in that. Why do you think that's becoming increasingly prevalent, and why do we desire this more?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Great two questions. So what I would say about dissociation, then I'll get to a direct answer to his question. Remember, dissociation is designed for kids to protect kids and help them survive horrible situations. It works well in a really sick environment. But as children become adults, dissociation does not work well in real life at all. You know, if I stand in front of you and I dissociate and go away, is it going to help you? Or I'm driving a car, or I'm trying to do a job, or my wife and I are on a date, and I'm dissociating away. It doesn't work in the adult world. And that's why people seek treatment, because they have to go from being separated to integrated. I hear what you're saying. There's a lot in our culture many of us are really worried about, including that. Dissociation is like admired and wanted and appreciated and sought after and checked out of reality. And I don't know what the research is saying. I know it sure scares me, because dissociation does not work in the adult world at all. So why is that? I think everybody likes relief. What is the great benefit of dissociating? It's nice to take a break. Real life is stressful and hard, and you get sick and tired of dealing with it. So it's another escape like addictions would be. It's another escape like avoidance would be. But it's more internal. It's hiding inside. And so when people seek treatment, they're typically seeking treatment because it's not working very well in the adult life like it did and it doesn't work, by the way, in a healthy child's life, but in their child life it was functional, it was protected. There's a lot of spiritual issues related to dissociation, and especially DID, that I want to touch on. Now, the psychological community would think I'm crazy. So there's the proclaimer. Because according to them, there's no evil, there's no such thing as spirits and demons and angels, and everything is reality. And so they think we're nuts when we think that. The flip side as Christians is we know what the biblical truth is. There are demons and angels. There is spiritual warfare and fight around us. There are people like the Jeremiah 7 example who worship Satan and serve him. The occult is real. God is real. There's a real battle all around. And I always think that's a great niche for anybody who works in the Christian care world, whether a counselor or a pastor, whether a child care worker, whatever you end up doing, to be able to tune into the spiritual part of it. A lot of our tests in psychology make you sound nuts. There's an MMPI too, a test we use extensively. And one of the questions to gauge delusional disorders is, do you believe there's such a thing as spirits around? So according to them, Jesus was delusional, which, in reality, you deal with it frequently. Now, when you get to the high end of the spectrum, DID, dissociative identity disorder, there's a very high likelihood of satanic or ritual abuse of one sort or another. It's not at all unusual to encounter them who are demon-possessed, who have heavy spiritual oppression, who have a heavy occult or satanic experiences in their past. And remember, a lot of this happened when they were a child or maybe a young adolescent. So they were the victim, they weren't the perpetrator. But if eventually they became a perpetrator, they became a perpetrator mimicking what they experienced as children. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. A woman that I've worked with for years who was a DID. She had about 200 personalities when I started working with her. She was a Christian, had known the Lord for a while, but had also a lot of demonic activity going on in her life. And she was ritualistically abused over many years. Her father took it to a satanic group that was from the Masonic background. That's one of the Freemason, the Masonic culture is one of the subcultures that some of our abuse survivors have, where they got exposed to it. And she had vivid descriptions of all the abuse and laying on the altar and all the rapes and the rituals, and to incredible detail. And this started happening to her when she was about age 4 or 5. And she grew up in the greater Denver area, so it was a local person. And she, in her neighborhood, had a Christian family right across the street who she really liked the kids. And she used to go over and play with the kids over there. Well, they started playing in the basement of the Christian family, and she and her sister, who also went through the same abuse, reenacted the satanic ritual abuse with the Christian kids in the basement of the Christian home. Know what they were doing. I mean, it wasn't like my client said, oh, this is a great idea. It was a personality, a part, having to act this out. And one day, the dad of the Christian family walks down in the basement and sees this ritual going on, including my client, who was the older one, laying naked, laying on top of their daughter, who was naked on an altar, reenacting this whole scene. So this is the way it will sometimes perpetuate as well. So spiritual reality, the more you wade into this kind, is you've got to, as a Christian, get within your comfort zone to deal with it, even though the greater psychological community is going to truly think you're nuts. One of my more vivid experiences was at a mental health hospital, and one of my DID clients who was also ritualistically abused, and she actually was demon-possessed. We ended up having to cast demon out of her later. And the demon in session would come out and threaten to kill me and do all these things. And so she's in a hospital, and I go to the hospital as the outside therapist, meeting with the in-hospital team, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the occupational therapist, you know, where they do these planning teams. And we're having this discussion about her, and she's severe bipolar, satanic abuse, DID. I mean, she had a lot of things going on. And by the way, she's been fully healed and doing well, so there's another great story. But the process was quite a process. So I'm sitting in this meeting. Well, the psychologist in the meeting happens to also be a Christian. She's a psychologist working in the hospital, but a very marginal Christian, just kind of, she was a believer and went to church, but you wouldn't know by her testimony, by her counseling, any of that. So we're in this meeting, there's about 8 or 10 of us in it. She looks me right in the eye and says, so Doug, do you think the client here is possessed? Now we're in a purely secular setting. If I say yes, they're going to try to hospitalize me. If I say no, I'm lying. And my client is there, and my client's husband is there, and they know the truth. In fact, the client and I were dealing with the demonic stuff. We eventually cast the demon out, but hadn't at that point. And so there's this super tense silence. I didn't say anything. I just sat there. And finally, the secular psychiatrist, who was just so uncomfortable, said, oh, we don't need to talk about that. And he switched the subject, and we just continued talking. And I left without ever answering the question. After the meeting, I called the psychologist, and I said, how dare you? How dare you, as a Christian, ask me a question like that in that kind of... She said, well, I guess I never have decided what I think about demons in the spirit world. Is it real or not? I guess I look at it as a metaphor, not literal, like when Jesus is casting a demon out. They're not literal demons. It's just a metaphor of evil. And I said, well, if you don't know what you're talking about or what you think, how dare you put me on the spot? So we had a come to Jesus moment between her and I. But I give you that as an illustration of the secular world and how they view it. So if you're gonna come alongside and help them spiritually, just know that you need to be wise and you need to be discreet in the whole process. And get some training. Do not wade into the spiritual part of this without knowing what you're doing, or you can do a lot of harm. Most of the research with DID also shows a very high correlation with bipolar disorder, primarily bipolar 1. There's something like 60% comorbidity that DID and bipolar tend to travel together. So be aware of that. Now, that is not saying 60% of bipolars have DID. That's not what it's saying. You got that? It's saying of the DIDs, about 60% end up being diagnosed as bipolar. And I don't know how much you all know about bipolar, but when you think of about how labile, how up and down and erratic and all around they can be, it makes sense that a DID type defense may have been developed. Yes?
I guess that was kind of my question, like how they relate, because I had a roommate who had both of those, and so just learning about that was interesting.
Yeah.
So, what is it? Just like the high intensity of switching emotions that creates the switching of, like the switching you see with bipolar disorder?
Yeah, well, in terms of bipolar disorder, the main thinking now is it's mostly genetic, not environmental. Now, there are environmental factors that influence that. So what you have to do is say, okay, they develop DID in response to abuse, but they may or may not have become a bipolar had they grown up in a perfectly healthy home. So I think that it's because of the emotional instability of bipolar that they feel so out of control, and the emotions when they get them are so intense and overwhelming that they create their escape hatches, they create their places they go and hide. The other thing I find about bipolar and DID is, remember, if you have a DID person you're working with, they were horribly abused. I mean, it's bad. Well, it makes sense bipolar would travel in that family, because the odds are good one of their abusers may have been untreated bipolar. And because of their own bipolar, been that much more cruel and harsh and abusive to the client. So, I'm not saying bipolar doesn't cause DID and DID doesn't cause bipolar, but what I am saying is they frequently travel together. So in a professional setting, often when I'm suspecting that there's high level of dissociation, whether fully to the DID or maybe to one of the lesser ones, but still up the continuum, I'm almost always asking for a psychiatric evaluation to be done, just to make sure, because more often than not, bipolar is very common.
So what are some of the things that you would notice with someone who had DID or was on that spectrum? Like, how do you start to recognize it?
Yeah, so how to diagnose this? So there's a number of things to pay attention to. The classic symptom of a dissociative person is when you're talking to them, they go away. It's almost like a curtain just pulls down, and their eyes go blank, and their affect just flattens out, and their face just kind of goes like this. That's like the dead giveaway. Sometimes with DID, another dead giveaway is their voices will change. They'll be talking one way, and then they'll all of a sudden have a little childlike voice or something. Voice switches. If they're writing, if you do journaling or writing projects, you'll see the handwriting change. The God-given ability to dissociate blows me away still after all these years. You can have a client who's dissociative and does amazing things and don't even know they do them. So I had a woman client I worked with for a number of years who was a DID, and she had about 10 personalities. And she had a little boy personality who wanted to write me secret notes. But he used cursive writing backwards. And he wrote absolutely perfectly. I mean, he never reversed a P or a B or any of that. It was literally flawless with this impeccable writing. And so she would give me a note written by this boy personality that was in her, and it was written backwards and going down the page. I couldn't read it. It was too confusing. So I borrowed a makeup mirror from my wife, and I would set this in my lap and hold the mirror up to reverse it, and then I could read it.
And then your wife's like, why
And like I say, never made a single mistake in his grammar, in his writing, in his grammar. It was flawless. I have another DID who was non-musical. She liked music, but non-musical. So as we're treating and going through the process, she and her husband go to a local mall, and there was a store in the mall selling organs and pianos. And there was one sitting out where you could just sit and play if you wanted to. And as far as she knew, she had no musical ability at all. She sits down at the piano, hitting a couple of keys, and all of a sudden, sight reading, I mean, she had no music or anything. She plays this beautiful Mozart piece, flawless. And the owner of the store came over watching her. He was like shocked, and he said, "Where did you learn that?" And she didn't really even know. And a crowd gathered around that because she was playing this piece absolutely exquisitely. She had no idea she knew how to play the piano, much less Mozart on the piano. And then all of a sudden she froze, freaked out, and never went near a piano ever again. And it was a personality part, and the reason she didn't is the piano teacher would rape her every time he came and did a piano lesson in the basement. So she had so dissociated from it that even though she had had piano lessons, it was like a part of her she couldn't even own. Yeah.
So it seems like these personalities are relevant to things that have happened to them, but some of it kind of seems a little bit random. So how do these personalities develop, and like why would this woman have a personality of a little boy?
Okay.
Where does that come from?
Good. I want to continue on the symptoms and get to that. So we're going to try to keep overlapping this a little bit. And I'll utterly confuse them, and you'll have to straighten it out. So another symptom you'll see, and I'll get to your question, don't worry. Another symptom you'll see is that people don't remember their past. People who are dissociative so dissociate away that when you ask them what is their early childhood memory, they will maybe remember something in junior high or high school, and then they have bits in college, and they don't remember much at all. And sometimes they'll describe it as kind of waking up. They'll say, well, I don't know, I don't remember anything, and then all of a sudden when I was 18, it's like I woke up. And so there's very sketchy or even non-existent memory of the past. There's really a lack of ability to self-regulate emotions. They live in constant fear and terror. They're constantly on edge all the time. They don't know it. That's normal for them. And so their emotional self-regulation, their childhood memories are all very, very poor. You'll find they come from universally bad backgrounds. If you find somebody with a pretty good background who's claiming to be dissociative, most of the time, I don't tend to believe it in my setting. I'm more curious why they're claiming that. I had one case of a missionary couple who came to me in the first visit. They told me the mom, the son, and the daughter were all three DID. And yet they were all raised in a perfectly healthy environment. And so it didn't take too long, and I finally said, no, they aren't. Who told them they were? And it turned out to be some counselor in another city that had diagnosed all three of them DID, and conveniently she worked with DID, so she was creating business for herself, I guess. And I said, no, they aren't. And so the son got all this special preferential treatment in the high school he was going to because he was mentally ill. And so because he'd been diagnosed DID, so he got all this special treatment. And so finally, after I did my process and I came back to the mom and dad and I said, your son is not DID, he's playing you. And they asked me to go to the school, so I went to the school meeting with the principal and the dean and the teachers and the school counselors, and he was there and the mom and dad were there, and they said, he's not DID at all. And they said, and they've been treating him with kind of special treatment for years. So I said, well, what do we do? And I said, put him in the normal class and expect him to do all the work everybody else is supposed to do. Give him a few weeks to catch up, but throw him in. And you can imagine the looks I was getting from the guy. He wasn't happy with me. And that was the end of the time that I'd worked with that family. Well, fast forward 6-8 years later, I get a call, and guess who it was from? This guy who's now an adult, young adult man. And he said, I need more counseling and I want to see you. And I said, well, frankly, I'm surprised. Why do you want to see me after what I did? And he said, you're the only one I couldn't fool. I could fool everybody else, but I couldn't fool you. Now, as people dissociate and develop personalities, the question was, why are there different personalities? Why are there sometimes guy personalities and woman personalities and all of that? First of all, a word about men. When men become DID, it's very rare to see them in a counseling setting like mine. Why? Well, the thinking is because most male DIDs end up in prison. And I've had a number of counselors who work in the prison setting who've told me that they see a number of men there that appear to be DID. What is it? Well, with all the switching and the anger and the testosterone and all the physiological expressions of guys, they tend to end up eventually getting in trouble with the law. Every once in a while, I'll see a Christian guy who may be pretty dissociative, but I tend to see far more women than I think, precisely because of the population. When women get DID and highly dissociative, they develop personalities that create functions. Remember my premise. Parts are God-given. Dissociation is a God-given protection. So they will have parts that serve functions. So often there'll be a little girl part, a little child part. Why? Well, because they were normal when they were born. They weren't dissociative. God didn't create them dissociative. So they were their normal person for the first part of their life until the abuse started getting bad and the dissociating started getting worse. So they're kind of the normal little child part. As the abuse begins to accumulate, they have to begin to create parts to deal with the abuse. Why? So it's compartmentalized. So they can go through the rest of their day. They can go to school and forget the fact that stepdad raped them the night before. They can't go to school remembering that. It has to be sort of erased, wiped away. And so they'll create a personality that stays in the bed when stepdad comes and hurts them. And then after stepdad leaves, that part falls asleep. Well, the little girl, the original little girl, wakes up in the morning and goes to school. Does that make sense? So they create parts that align with the kind of abuse that they're having. And the more severe the trauma, the more personalities they'll have. And often you'll run into clusters of personalities around specific type of abuse. So if they're satanically abused, you may find 6 or 8 personalities that are hardcore Satan worshipers. And when they're out talking, they're cursing God and praising Satan and talking about they like the demons and all of that sort of thing. If the abuse occurs by both mom and dad, if both participate, there'll be a whole cluster of personalities around the mom abuse that'll be different than around the dad abuse. And most DIDs have protector parts, parts that are the protectors that are supposed to come out when they need to stand up, to be firm and strong and scare people away and be tough. And for girls, often those are male parts. They may be female, but sometimes they're male. So this client I'm talking about had a boy, and this boy's job was to be strong and either try to scare the abuser away, that was always never very assertive, or boss the internal girl parts about who had to go out and deal with what was happening. So he was like the gatekeeper, and he bossed the personalities out. Oh, your turn. Stepdad just walked in the room. You got to go out there now. And mom's outside listening to what's going on. You got to go handle it now. Does that make sense? in a demented way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So if this happens so often in childhood, is it difficult to like recognize in children? So I feel like as a teacher, you wouldn't see the personality of when the kid is being abused or when the kid,
Right.
Goes home. You'd only see the daytime or in school. So is it hard to find, and is that why it seems like often you're dealing with adults, or is it just because you didn't have
Yeah, I don't work with children personally, but what you'll see on the playground or in the classroom is dissociative kids. Again, you'll find that blank sense. They're often loners, so they're very isolated, and they're really good at not being noticed. They just fly under the radar. They're not saying, "Teacher, I know the answer." They're sitting quietly in the corner, and when the break comes, they just kind of disappear. And so what you're going to see is a lot of flatness. Now, if they make a comment, they may test you as a teacher, float something by you and see what you do with it. And sometimes it's so opaque and so unclear, you may not exactly know what they're saying, but they may float a comment by like, I got scared last night. May just drop some little thing, and in their mind, they just told you, and they're hoping you're going to help them, if that makes sense. But periodically, there are these opaque examples, but mostly the children, they're not engaging with the other kids. Socially, they're isolating. Intellectually, DID is a defense of the bright. You cannot have a low IQ DID person. It's a very complex defense. You've got to be a very smart person to figure out how to manage this. And so children who are very, very bright, and you could tell it as a teacher, but they just don't, they're massively underachieving, or they just disengage. Again, I pay attention to some of those things. Yes?
Did that lady identify that it was a little boy in her? Like, did you have to, like...
Yeah, I'm very careful not to initially be the provoker to draw things out. I'm not saying things like, are you DID? Do you have personalities? What are your names? Because people like this are highly suggestible. So if as a counselor you get too pushy, they want to please you, so they'll all of a sudden develop somebody, whether they have one or not. So I'm very, and Dr. Mitch can talk about it, you need special training in this area. But when they start coming out, she told me. She said, well, I have a personality named Ben who wants to talk to you. Okay? I'll talk to Ben then, whoever Ben is. Yeah.
So is it always a concrete, separate personality that they recognize as someone separate as who they are behaving as currently?
So you all heard the question, right? Separate? Go back to your progressive sheet. When it gets all the way up to DID, yes, it's very separate.
And they name that, like they will recognize all of these separate personalities.
Well, they won't be co-conscious initially, so they won't know them all or recognize them. But they'll just know they lose time. All of a sudden, I don't know how, but I woke up driving my car. It's like they space traveled and don't know it. Or they'll say, I have all these clothes in my closet. I don't know where they came from. It's so compartmentalized. And so even though they're all there, they may not even know about each other, except they know the switching. But they're distinct. The further where it's high but not fully developed, it may not be that distinct.
But as a clinician, like you would be able to tell that is
Right.
what's different.
That's what you, as a clinician, you're spending time sorting out, right?
Got you. Okay, cool.
Yes?
Are the parts that they don't remember typically the satanic parts?
Or typically what?
Are they considered the satanic parts even if they have?
Not necessarily. Yeah, they might be, absolutely. The satanic parts aren't going to be remembered typically. They're going to be hidden away because that's a dark, evil world. But they'll break apart to where, and it's because they don't want linkage. They don't want leaking from the part that's getting abused to the part that goes to class and sits in your classroom as you give them a lesson. So they're trying to put walls up so nothing leaks through. And so often, early on, when you begin counseling, people may come to you saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm just all over the place. I don't know who I am. Often spouses will say, boy, I don't know what's wrong, but get help, that kind of thing. And initially, the first part of the treatment process is just to get to know the person and stay very grounded in the here and now. I am not asking about parts. even when I see them dissociate or know they're dissociating, I won't suggest that. I won't say, I'll just take my time and get acquainted. We'll deal with here and now things, because usually their life is a mess. They have a lot in their current life that needs help. And then they'll begin talking about how they don't know, something strange comes over them, or it's like, and then eventually one of your early clues is they'll start saying, it's weird, but I hear voices sometimes. And so I don't jump all over that either, because I tell myself stuff sometimes, So how do you know when it's actually a distinct voice? And so you're going to ask questions about, well, give me an example. What's a voice that you hear? And sometimes it'll come with a name. Sometimes they'll say, well, it's like a little girl, or it's like a teenage boy, or whatever. Sometimes, especially for Christians, if they've been satanically or ritually abused, one of the more disturbing things they'll tell you is while they're in church service worshiping the Lord, singing worship songs, their voice is inside cursing God while they're in church. And they're born-again Christians, but they have demonic oppression and things going on. And so anyway, they'll hear voices. Like I say, sometimes they'll find different hidden talents they have no idea they had. Another personality I worked with, another woman with DID, had a personality who all of a sudden one day, I'd been working with a woman for a while. It's not the piano woman, this is separate. But she brings a guitar to session one day, and I said, oh, I didn't know you played the guitar. And she said, I don't. And I said, well, why'd you bring the guitar then? I don't play it. And she said, because I have a part who wanted to play you something. And switched, pulled out the guitar, and she was right-handed, sat and played the guitar left-handed, and played me this whole song in session. And played pretty well, actually. So, you get into these strange and weird kind of situations. So what, yeah.
With like the treatment and stuff, how much power is there to like naming each personality and like each one having a name? Like, and with the treatment process, is it like going from one, like reducing it from one personality down until you just get one, or is it just focusing on the act of dissociating? But once they learn how to not dissociate, that takes care of like all of the parts.
Well, the treatment is a progression from when they're scattered and disordered to where they get to initially know each other. We call that co-consciousness. That's where they all know about each other, and they can all hear each other talk. They're like when one is out, the others are just behind, listening in or hearing. And that's a really important place to get to in treatment, co-consciousness, because now they can begin to live an integrated life. They know who's driving the car, who went to church, who's going to school, whatever it is. There's more of a congruity to their life. But as a Christian counselor, I can never believe co-consciousness is enough. There are secular people out there who say that's all you need. As a Christian, when I read Scripture, the Bible talks a lot about we're made whole and complete and one. And so I'm absolutely adamant that biblically the goal is complete integration. I'm not a big one. It's called mapping. Mapping is where you get the DID to lay out, okay, what's every personality, what are their names, how old they are, and draw this whole map. I have clients that have done that, but I'm not a big fan. I don't stop them when they say, I want to draw it out for you. I'll say, fine. But I don't ask it as homework typically. And I've worked with a lot of DIDs through the years. I've had every extreme for when God literally, they did a lot of work. They were with me for a number of years, but then it was like overnight, God just healed them into one. Amazing. I've progressive, so maybe two personalities will end up joining and become one kind of newer one, and it just slowly filters down. And like I said, because a lot of personalities cluster around abuse, maybe you get a cluster of 3 or 4 personalities that went to school. Well, it's easier for them to all integrate then into one because they all did a similar function. So sometimes you'll do that. It'll go progressively into more and more fewer and fewer personalities, and eventually merge into one. sometimes, well, bear in mind, first of all, your client is also a personality. Remember that. Whoever walked in your office and filled out the paperwork and said, my name is Doug, is also a personality. They're all personalities. So, you know, there's just, the integration is taking everybody into one. Now, I always like to tell people, when I was a younger counselor, I was a lot smarter than I am now. I used to know so much more than I do now. And I've gotten a lot dumber with age. I just can't always anticipate what God's going to do. So I really push every part to accept Christ as Savior. By the way, I have no idea how a secular counselor does this. And secondly, I teach them that Christ is the one who's going to integrate them, because he's the only one who knows how God made him to begin with. Right? And so he's going to do it. And one of the things I love about counseling as a Christian counselor working with DID and dissociation is just watching how Christ merges and integrates. And it's absolutely awesome to watch and amazing. And I'm always blown away. And every person is so different from the person before. So sometimes it's that slow progression. That one case, it was a miraculous moment. Often it's just the Lord kind of moving and joining some and taking some away and just doing what God does, and I get to enjoy the view. And then at some point, he'll have them integrated. Again, biblically, I think that's what God wants in every case. Yeah.
So are the skills, like for instance, the individual or the one who had the able to play the guitar and then also someone who's able to play the piano, those skills that they're not aware of, are majority of those connected to past abuse?
Right.
And what happens when, I guess, they find healing in the end? Do they actually still have that skill?
You know, they seem to lose it. It's the most fascinating thing. Because those skills that they got were so associated with abuse that it's like the association is so traumatizing that they went away from it. It's kind of like, you know, every time you go to downtown Denver, you know, you get assaulted. Well, it's not going to take too long and you're not going to want to go downtown Denver. It's kind of that idea. The trauma is so intense that once they separate, and when the Lord integrates them, it doesn't seem to matter. And I always tell people, well, you know, once you're integrated, if you want to try to play the guitar or play the piano, play Mozart like you did, then ask the Lord to help you do it. But I don't want the association with this ability or skill and the abuse. I want the abuse out of their lives. And this is a high-risk counseling population when you work with them. So you always have to be careful not to re-traumatize. If in your counseling you cause them to relive their abuse the way they had lived it the first time, you're going to do more harm than good. You cannot let re-traumatization occur. And yet you still need to talk about the past. They have to get it out. It's the very things that happen to them that they dissociate and separate so nobody else knows. You need to get co-conscious and ultimately integrated. Everybody needs to know everything inside. So as they're telling their stories, I'm always asking a million questions. I want them to be aware they're in 2017 in Doug's office. They're not 6 years old and stepdad's laying on top of them. Because if they're there, I'm not helping them because it's going to re-traumatize, and if anything, it's going to reinforce the abuse. So they have to process the abuse, but process it in a way that does not re-traumatize. Yeah?
So when the counseling process is complete and they become integrated, do they have full cohesive memories that are all...
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and they'll all remember all of it then. And then I always like a ritual, a closure of some sort. So when I leave here and go back to my office, I'm going to work with an integrated DID, just so happened to be on my schedule. She had about 10 or 12 personalities. She's fully integrated, doing well. They can often continue in therapy, though, because they're having to learn a whole new way of coping. Like I said, dissociation doesn't work in the adult world, so they've got to learn how to function in a healthier way. But she would, if she were here, she would tell you, I have 32 incidents of abuse. And she could tell you each one. Because, you know, now when we started, the parts had things all clustered and compartmentalized. But now she's actually written them out, all the specific just a queue again of the, and she'll tell you 32 different abuses. She was satanically abused. She was abused by an uncle and aunt. She was involved in, again, I don't want to put ugly images in your mind, but really bad stuff. So yeah, when there's co-conscious and then integration, they know their whole life. They can lay it out for you. But bear in mind, this is so shameful and so overwhelming and disgusting, they don't tend to want to go around telling their stories. And be very careful of a DID who loves to tell you all their stories. Number one, they're not integrated. They're probably something histrionic or something else going on. But if they're integrated, they'll be able to say, potentially, if they feel safe, that they were abused, but they won't go into detail. But if you get them privately, they'll be able to, all the parts, know the whole story, basically. Yeah.
So how, I don't know, how do you go about recalling all, like, every instance of abuse? Like, I feel like that's...
Okay, how do we go about recalling every incident or abuse? There's good news, bad news here. Number one, you don't need to recall every incident. They need to recall every category, but not every incident. So they need to be able to talk about each time when stepdad raped them, each time when mom beat them, each time, you know, the categories. But they don't need to detail every time an event occurred in the same category. So that's number one. Number two, I don't go fishing for gruesome memories. I just tell them, you know, pray about it, ask God to bring up what we need to. A personality comes out. I always spend a session or two just getting to know them, talking to them like they're a person who just walked off the street. And I'm not probing, well, you know, where'd you come from? Or how old were you when you were first born? Or what's your first memory? I'll get there and they'll start telling abuse stories when they do that. But initially I want to build a little bit of a relationship. But they will need to bring out every primary category of abuse. You don't want to let them keep things secret because, again, that fosters ongoing dissociation versus integration where it's all shared. And with some of our clients, they were abused so much by so many people so long, I can't even imagine every incident. So it's always by category. Yeah.
Do you have people who come into your office to begin with have a false identity or personality?
To be what?
Who originally come into your office for counseling, like you come in, the first person you meet is not their original personality?
Not the first time.
Okay.
The first time they'll come in professionally. They'll be the person who made the appointment, fill out the paperwork, you know, and plus they don't know me, and especially being a man, most have been majorly abused by men, typically by women too, but men in particular. So why should they trust me initially? So usually it's going to take a while, and then very often, and I always push them that just the adult drives the car. Nobody ever drives the car. You don't want them fighting behind the wheel who's driving, and you don't want a child parent driving because they're dangerous. And so often they'll drive and check in with our receptionist, but when I go down, there's somebody else different there. And they're looking at me glaring, and I can tell right away by the eyes that it's somebody different.
So as far as creating like a space to process these things in a way that will not re-traumatize the patient, you mentioned a couple things just as far as like letting them make sure they're cognizant of the fact that they are in 2017 in your office. Also not being careful to not call out certain things that they have not put a name to.
Right.
Do you have any other just like brief?
Yeah, breathing, the slow, deliberate breathing. Most people, when they get nervous or tense, they tense up their chest. Their breathing becomes short and they can hyperventilate. So you tell people to breathe slow, deep, diaphragm-type breathing. Sometimes I'll do what's called a grounding exercise in the middle of it and say, okay, what are 3 things you smell right now? What are 3 things you see? Name 2 things that you feel, touch, tactile feel, that sort of thing, just to bring them back again. And I'll always structure a session where if they're dissociating, I'll make sure that part of our session ends about 15 minutes before the end of the session. So we could just process and talk about what do you have next, how are the kids doing, Let your husband do, again, ground them back in 2017. Make sure that when they leave the office, they're leaving as the adult, not as the traumatized, powerless child. So you use things like that. I'll ask a lot of questions, and I use a lot of, with the Christians, who most of my DID clients that I'm willing to work with are Christians, I'll use a lot of, have you asked Jesus about that? What does Jesus say? Just stop, take a minute, and ask him. And that's another, not only is it a good grounding, because I'm asking him to do it, but again, it blows my mind that the Lord does so often with so many of these people when he speaks to them. Yeah?
When a patient tells you that they were abused by a church group or like some sort of an ongoing thing like that, are you allowed to do you contact authorities about that?
You know, if it's a child, absolutely. If it's an adult, we're actually not obligated to, you know, under Colorado state law right now. I have done that. I have contacted authorities and turned people in. I had one client, DID client, who told me about a human sacrifice where she was present at a ritual where a child was killed. So I did say, well, that was a capital offense, murder, so I said we do need to report that. And that girl was 17, so I had her bring her mom in with her, the two of them, and we talked about it in front of the mom, and I told the mom, you really need to call the police department and have them investigate this. And then the mom and daughter did go out with a police detective to investigate. I don't think they found enough proof that it might have happened, but they didn't find proof like human DNA. They found a place where rituals were happening in an isolated building. This was in the Inglewood area, but they couldn't find any actual human DNA to actually have a case to pursue. So, you know, once in a while you run into that. If it's church groups or things, that's something we talk a lot about in supervision. You have two issues. One is Colorado state law. If you're ordered to mandated report, by all means. But number two, when it's not mandated, there's a little bit of a judgment to use there. And, well, there's a lot I could say there. I'm picking my words on our tongue, so I don't know.
Any other questions for Doug before we end?
How closely is schizophrenia and DID connected?
Schizophrenia and DID almost never travel together that I've ever seen. Schizophrenia is a disorganized splitting of the mind. It's just kind of all over the place. DID is a very bright defense, very systematic, very intentional in structure, whereas the schizophrenic is just kind of all over. So they don't, it's a misdiagnosis. I've seen people who are truly DID called schizophrenic, or they're schizophrenic, or they're borderline. There are certain labels mental health people will put on a DID that are inaccurate and not call it what it is, but I don't find schizophrenia and DID traveling together.
All right, good enough. Thank you so much, Doug. We appreciate it.